I was lying there after the cesarean, unable to get up. And she stood next to me and told my husband, "This is not your baby. I gave birth to my son just 3 days ago, and every part of my body still feels like it's been torn apart and stitched back together with dental floss." 22 hours in the hospital, most of it gritting my teeth through pain that came in waves like a rising tide of knives. I hadn't even processed that I was finally a mother, that this tiny, fragile human was mine, when she said it. My mother-in-law, Diana. She walked into the hospital room with that same look of tight-lipped disapproval she always wears around me, like she's constantly tasting something sour. She didn't even glance at me. She went straight for the plastic hospital bassinet and peered down at my baby, this little person I just fought tooth and nail to bring into the world. Her face twisted, not in joy or love or even curiosity but suspicion. I was still too weak to sit up properly, propped awkwardly against pillows, my hospital gown clinging to me with sweat and milk. I said, "Hi," my voice hoarse from exhaustion, and she barely acknowledged it. Then she said it, clear and cold like she was ordering a drink at a bar. "I want a paternity test." I thought I misheard her. The room fell completely silent, except for the soft hum of the 4 monitor. Sam, my husband, was sitting in the chair next to my bed holding my hand. His grip stiffened. She didn't stop there. She leaned closer to the bassinet, her eyes narrowing as if she were examining a fake purse. I will not hold a bastard from a stranger's child in my arms. My heart didn't break. It detonated. Something inside me just exploded, and all the exhaustion, the fear, the sheer vulnerability of the past 3 days turned into something sharp and unbearable. My body was still bleeding. I hadn't even had time to shower properly. And this woman who's hated me from day one, who once picked up my son from school without asking just to prove she could, was standing here calling my newborn son a bastard. Sam didn't say anything. Not at first. His face went pale and then red, and I could feel the tension roll off him like a storm front. But he didn't defend me. Not immediately. He looked at his mother like she'd just slapped him, but the words weren't there. And I just lay there, completely undone. The 4 in my arm, the soreness between my legs, the ache in my breast from feeding, and now this cruel accusation in the very first hours of our son's life. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. I couldn't find the right words, only the urge to scream. It was a moment when something snapped in me, so sharp and sudden I could almost hear it, like a thread that had been pulled too tight finally giving way. I sat there in that sterile hospital room, the words, "I want a paternity test," still ringing in my ears, but what actually filled my mind wasn't the insult she just hurled at my newborn son, it was everything that came before. Every memory came flooding in, uninvited and vivid, dragging me back to the days when Karen, my mother-in-law, was practically helpless. She'd fallen down the stairs just a few months after I started dating David, and I had foolishly believed back then that helping her would make her accept me, or at the very least tolerate my existence. She had broken her hip in 2 places, shattered her wrist, and suffered a concussion that left her disoriented and emotionally volatile. David was working long shifts at the time, and Karen didn't want strangers in her home. So I stepped in, not because she asked but because I loved him, and I thought maybe, just maybe, if I showed her who I really was, she'd stop looking at me like I was some parasite clinging to her only son. I fed her. I changed her bandages. I bathed her. I held her upright when she needed to use the bathroom because she was too proud to let a nurse help. I cleaned her house when she couldn't lift a finger, sat by her bedside when she cried out from the pain in her sleep, and endured her endless critiques of how I folded towels, how I cooked, how I breathed. I still remember the day I brought her soup and she said it was too salty, then dumped the whole bowl down the drain while I stood there in silence, fighting tears. I told myself she was in pain, she was vulnerable, she didn't mean it. I told myself that love meant stepping up, even when it was uncomfortable. I told myself that eventually she'd see how hard I was trying. But she never did. Not when I stood by David through his father's passing. Not when I planned every detail of our wedding while she nitpicked the guest list. Not when I held her hand during physical therapy. And not now, especially not now, as she stood over my 3-day-old son and called him a stranger's bastard. Her adult children, 2 sons living comfortably in Texas and Florida, and a daughter overwhelmed with her own chaotic household full of toddlers and teens, were either unable or completely unwilling to lift a finger. I remember listening to Karen on the phone, cooing sweetly to each of them, telling them not to worry, that she was being well looked after, never once mentioning it was me doing everything. David had just started a demanding new job, pulling 12-hour shifts 6 days a week, and he barely had time to sleep, let alone help with his mother's recovery. So when Karen looked at me with that weak, trembling voice and said she didn't know how she'd manage on her own, I agreed. Just like that. No hesitation, no second thought. Because that's what you do when you love someone, right? You make sacrifices. Every day for nearly 3 months I showed up at her house. I'd arrive with groceries, my hair still wet from my morning shower, and she'd already be shouting through the door that the porch was dusty or that she hadn't had her pills yet. I cleaned her bathroom on my knees, scrubbed the mildew from the shower tiles, washed her clothes by hand when she claimed the washer made everything smell like metal. I cooked meals exactly how she said she liked them. No garlic, no onion, no weird spices, only to have her push the plate away half the time and complain that I was trying to ruin her digestion. I drove her to every doctor's appointment, sitting in lobbies for hours while she came out with another list of things she needed from the pharmacy and not a single word of thanks. I wiped up her spills, managed her moods, pretended not to notice the way she rolled her eyes when I mentioned David, and stayed long after the sun had set to make sure she'd eaten and taken her meds. And through it all, I kept thinking this is what people mean when they talk about doing the right thing. I told myself I was being kind. I told myself this was temporary. I told myself more than once that she would eventually look at me and see not just David's girlfriend, or some woman taking up space in her son's life, but a real person, a daughter-in-law worthy of a little bit of grace. But none of that happened. Instead, here she was now, standing beside my son's crib with her arms crossed like a judge passing sentence. And every moment I'd spent breaking my back for her over those 3 months felt like it had meant absolutely nothing. Karen did not say a single thank you. Not once, not even in passing. Instead, every day brought a new complaint, a fresh critique, a deeper cut masked as concern. If I folded her sheets the wrong way, she'd pull them out and do it over with exaggerated sighs. If I served her food too hot, she'd glare at me like I'd committed some personal betrayal. If I sat down for 5 minutes to catch my breath, she'd suddenly remember some chore she needed done right that second. There was never a moment of peace in that house, only the sharp sting of her disappointment in everything I did. She told me the floors were never clean enough, even though I vacuumed and mopped every other day. She said the meals I cooked were too greasy, too bland, too foreign, depending on her mood. She accused me of being careless when her water glass once tipped over, and when I gently reminded her it was her own elbow that knocked it down, she snapped that I should have been paying better attention. Still, I endured it. I swallowed my pride, bit my tongue so hard I sometimes tasted blood, and told myself this was all temporary. That it was grief, pain, frustration, not who she truly was. I kept telling myself that if I stayed patient, if I kept showing up, if I made it impossible for her to deny how much I cared for David, she would soften. She would see me. But I was wrong. Instead of changing, she hardened. The more I gave, the more she demanded. The more I tried to please her, the more contempt she seemed to gather in her eyes. It wasn't just that she didn't like me, she refused to see me as a person at all. I was a placeholder. A servant. Someone to tolerate, barely, because her son had chosen me. And as I stood there in that hospital room, 3 days postpartum and bleeding into a pad the size of a mattress, her words about my son being a bastard felt like the final act in a performance I had never agreed to audition for. David and I got married a year and a half later, in a small ceremony surrounded by close friends and a few family members who genuinely supported us, though Karen attended with the same pinched expression she wore at every milestone of our relationship, as if each moment of happiness for us was somehow a personal insult to her. She didn't cry during the vows, didn't smile in the photos, didn't offer a single word of blessing or warmth. Still, I made a conscious choice that day, standing there in my dress with David's hand in mine, to not let her bitterness taint what was meant to be our beginning. I told myself that being civil, being kind, and avoiding unnecessary conflict was the best way forward. I didn't want to cause more tension than already existed, especially not for David's sake. So I kept my head down, avoided confrontation, and forced myself to believe that things would smooth over in time. But everything changed after the birth of our first child. It was as though something inside Karen twisted even further, like she couldn't stand the fact that I had given her a grandchild, that I had brought this new life into the world and now held something she couldn't control. From the moment she walked into the hospital room, it was clear that the fragile truce I had been holding onto for years had shattered. She didn't look at me with any of the awe or softness most people show toward a woman who's just given birth. She didn't ask how I was feeling, didn't comment on the baby's tiny fingers or the way he wriggled in his swaddle. She looked at him like he was an object to inspect, and at me like I was something foul stuck to the bottom of her shoe. The hostility that had once been subtle, hidden in tight smiles and backhanded compliments, now stood fully exposed. And in that moment, the years of effort, the silence I had swallowed, the abuse I had tolerated, all of it unraveled, and I realized that nothing I had done had ever made a difference. Her disdain had never faded. It had only grown teeth. When Karen entered the room, she didn't say hello, didn't ask how I was feeling, didn't even acknowledge that I had just gone through 22 hours of labor and 3 days of aching, bleeding, and barely sleeping. She didn't look me in the eye, not once. She just walked in with her usual stiff posture and tight-lipped expression, eyes scanning the room like she was inspecting a crime scene. Without a word to either me or David, she moved straight toward the hospital crib, standing over our newborn son like a border guard checking for forged documents. She stared at him in silence, long enough for the air in the room to grow heavy with discomfort. There was no affection in her eyes, no warmth, not even curiosity. It wasn't the gaze of a grandmother meeting her grandson for the first time. It was colder, clinical, like she was searching for evidence of something sinister. Her mouth curled slightly as if she didn't like what she saw, and then in the most casual voice, as though she were commenting on the weather, she said, "You need to take a paternity test." For a moment I couldn't even process the words. They didn't seem real. I thought maybe I'd imagined it or that the pain meds were messing with my hearing. But then she turned her head slowly and looked at David, not at me, and added, "I will not hold a bastard from a stranger's child in my arms." Just like that. Calm, precise, and cruel. As if what she'd said wasn't a grenade tossed into the middle of the most vulnerable moment of my life. As if she hadn't just shattered what little remained of my dignity after giving birth. And as I lay there, raw in every sense of the word, I realized that there was no bottom to how low this woman would go to humiliate me. It turned out that all of this, the accusation, the demand for a paternity test, the poison Karen had so effortlessly dripped into the most sacred moment of my life, stemmed from a Facebook post. Not even a recent one. My ex-boyfriend, the same man I had left over a year before I ever met David, had decided to vomit some bitterness online for reasons I'll never fully understand. He wrote something nasty, vague but damaging, implying that I had cheated on him and that I was the type to move on fast. It was petty, vindictive nonsense, the kind of thing you expect from someone who can't accept rejection with grace. But instead of treating it like the pathetic attempt at relevance that it was, Karen took it as gospel. She read it, decided it aligned perfectly with whatever narrative she had already built in her mind about me, and believed it without hesitation. She didn't ask David. She didn't talk to me. She didn't even consider that it might be a lie. She saw it, clutched it like a trophy, and used it as her excuse to throw a grenade into our lives. That one toxic post was all it took for her to rewrite history, to erase the years I had spent proving myself, to reduce me to a caricature of someone unworthy. And the worst part wasn't even the fact that she believed him. It was that she wanted to. She wanted a reason to justify the way she'd always felt about me, to vindicate the cruelty she had never once apologized for. And instead of protecting us, instead of standing up for me, his wife, the mother of his child, David just sat there, stunned and silent, while his mother ripped me to pieces with a rumor from someone who didn't even matter anymore. When David, still trying to salvage the moment, picked up our son and gently moved toward her, holding out his arms like some fragile offering of peace, Karen recoiled as if the baby were something toxic. She stepped back sharply, her face twisting into something almost feral, and in a voice that was low and venomous, she hissed, "You don't even see that this woman has slipped you another man's child. You are as foolish as your father." The words hung in the room like smoke, thick, choking, impossible to ignore. David froze, the baby nestled against his chest, unaware of the chaos unraveling around him. I could feel the pressure in my chest, the sting rising behind my eyes, but I refused to let her see me cry. I had bled for this child. I had screamed through the agony of labor. I had carried him inside me for 9 months, feeling every flutter, every kick, every twist of life. And now here she was, calling him a fraud, calling me a liar, and dragging her own dead husband into it like his ghost had been waiting for the insult. There was a silence that followed, sharp and brittle, and for the first time I think even David didn't know what to say. The woman who had once pretended to be a grandmother-in-waiting had revealed herself completely, and what stood before us now wasn't just a difficult mother-in-law, it was someone who was willing to destroy her own family rather than admit she'd been wrong about me. And then, for the first time in all the years I had known him, David snapped, not with raised fists or shouted words, but with a quiet, cold fury that seemed to shake the air around him. He didn't yell, but his voice cut through the room like a knife as he turned to his mother and said, "How would you feel, Karen, if someone accused you of the same thing? If someone looked at me and said I wasn't my father's son?" Her expression barely had time to shift before he continued, his eyes locked on hers, unblinking. How would you feel if they dragged up the fact that you had an affair with Dad's business partner? If they said that's why our family fell apart because you couldn't stay faithful? Karen's face turned as white as the bedsheets beneath me. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. For the first time since she had walked into that room, she looked completely disarmed, like the ground beneath her had shifted and she didn't know where to plant her feet. I watched her grasp for composure, for some semblance of the control she always clung to, but it was gone. David had pulled the curtain back, exposed the hypocrisy that lay at the root of every cruel word she'd ever spoken, and left her with nothing but silence. It was the first time I had ever seen her speechless. And in that moment, I realized that the truth had always been her greatest fear, not mine. She screamed then, not just loud but raw and furious, her voice cracking under the weight of her rage, as she pointed at David and called him a traitor. Her words came fast, venomous, accusing him of abandoning the woman who gave him life, of letting me twist him into someone who would turn his back on his own blood. "She's poisoned you," she spat, her eyes wild as she jabbed a trembling finger in my direction. "She's turned you against your own mother." The room erupted into chaos, her voice echoing off the sterile walls, David trying to keep his tone level but firm, telling her she needed to leave. But she wasn't hearing him. She was spiraling, her accusations growing louder and more desperate, blaming me for everything from their strained relationship to the way his father died, as if I had somehow orchestrated the last 20 years of their dysfunction. I was shaking, clinging to the edge of the hospital bed, my son's tiny body tucked against my chest as if I could somehow shield him from the bitterness being hurled like shrapnel across the room. It was too much. The tension, the shouting, the raw ache in my body, it all became unbearable. My hands trembled as I reached for the call button and pressed it, whispering that I needed help. A nurse arrived within moments, and David, recognizing that things were seconds away from completely unraveling, took his mother by the arm and led her out into the hallway. She was still yelling, still accusing, her voice growing fainter with each step away from the door. And then it was quiet. I stayed there, alone with our son, tears slipping down my cheeks, soaking the top of his blanket as he slept on my chest, blissfully unaware of the storm that had just passed through. Later that night, after the hospital had gone quiet and the lights in our room had dimmed to a soft amber glow, David sat beside my bed with his head in his hands and told me something I don't think he'd ever spoken aloud before. His voice was low, flat in a way that made my heart ache, and he wouldn't meet my eyes as he said, "When I was a kid, maybe 7 or 8, I overheard my mom arguing with Dad's business partner." He paused for a long time after that, like the memory itself was something he didn't want to touch. Then he exhaled slowly and continued, "The man was shouting, really shouting, that he had a right to see his child. That she couldn't just shut him out like that. He said he wasn't going to be treated like some secret to be buried." David swallowed hard and rubbed the back of his neck. At the time, I didn't know what any of it meant. I was just a kid, listening from the top of the stairs trying to stay quiet. But then a few months later, Karen gave birth to my younger sister. He finally looked at me then and I saw it in his eyes, not just anger but grief. Decades of it. Confusion that had grown up alongside him, finally giving way to clarity that hurt more than the mystery ever did. I asked my dad once years later if she was really his, he said. He just stared out the window for a long time and said, "Some things are better left alone." David let out a bitter laugh, but it didn't reach his face. "And now she has the nerve to accuse you of infidelity?" I didn't know what to say. There were no words big enough to hold the weight of what he'd just laid in front of me. But in that moment, everything made sense. The anger, the control, the desperate need to shape the narrative around her. Karen hadn't just been cruel. She had been hiding something her entire life. And now, in the face of our son's innocent existence, she was unraveling. Karen didn't stop, not after the hospital, not after being let out of the room, not after David confronted her with truths she had buried for decades. If anything, being challenged only seemed to ignite something darker in her, something more desperate and unhinged. 3 days after we came home from the hospital, still exhausted and sore, still learning how to swaddle and latch and sleep in 30-minute increments, we were jolted from a rare moment of peace by furious pounding on the front door. The baby had just fallen asleep on my chest, and the sound made him flinch and whimper in his sleep. Then came the shouting. She was on the porch, screaming loud enough for the neighbors to hear, her voice hoarse and unrelenting. She called me a manipulator, a liar, a homewrecker. She shouted that I had brainwashed David, turned him into a stranger, and destroyed their family. Her fists hit the door again and again, and I could hear her pacing outside like a caged animal. I stayed in the living room holding my son tight against me, trying not to cry, trying not to let my hands shake. David stood frozen in the hallway, torn between anger and disbelief, his face pale and drawn as he listened to his mother unravel on our doorstep. But I had reached my breaking point. I rose carefully, cradling my son in one arm, and with the other I opened the door just a crack, enough to be heard but not enough to let her see us. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I just said, my voice steady and cold, "You will no longer have access to our lives. Not to me. Not to my son. Not anymore." And then I closed the door in her face, slowly, deliberately, as she stood there sputtering with disbelief. I locked it, turned the deadbolt, and walked back to the couch with tears silently falling down my cheeks. I had just given birth, and yet somehow this, cutting her out, felt like the most painful labor of all. Later that evening, after the house had gone quiet again and Karen's furious presence had finally retreated from our doorstep, I sat on the edge of our bed with our son in my arms and told David what had been building inside me for far too long. My voice shook, not from fear but from the sheer emotional exhaustion of holding it all in. I told him that I regretted those months I had spent caring for his mother. I told him that I regretted every dinner I cooked, every appointment I drove her to, every hour I spent trying to prove I was worthy of her decency, because no matter what I did, she never respected me, not even for a second. David stood in the doorway and I saw the way those words hit him. His face shifted, just slightly, but enough to know I had hurt him. He didn't say anything at first, just lowered his eyes and crossed his arms, and I knew what he was thinking. That I was talking about him. That my regret somehow included him. But I couldn't let that misunderstanding linger, not for a heartbeat longer. So I looked up at him, my eyes full, my voice calmer now, and said, "I don't regret helping you. Not for a second. I would do it all again every day because I love you and I believe in who we are. What I regret is doing all of that for a person who has spent every moment since trying to destroy our family. I regret giving my heart and my time to someone who only ever wanted to see me fail." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I think for the first time he understood the weight I had been carrying alone. And in that silence, something shifted between us. Not broken, not bitter. Just real. Honest. The cost of loving someone while constantly being forced to defend your place in their life. Then everything went downhill faster than I ever could have imagined. It started quietly with David's younger sister, prompted by everything that had been said, everything that had been left unsaid, deciding to take a paternity test of her own. There had always been whispers, questions that never made it to the dinner table but hung heavy in the air. And when the results came back, they confirmed what no one had dared to say aloud for years. Their father was not her biological father. That truth, once unearthed, cracked something wide open in Karen. It was as if the fragile structure of control and denial she had spent decades building finally came crashing down around her, and rather than face the ruins, she chose to torch everything in sight. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She didn't even try to contain the damage. Instead, she imploded, lashing out at everyone with venom that shocked even those who had known her longest. She hurled insults at her own children, called them ungrateful, disloyal, accused them of humiliating her on purpose, of conspiring to destroy her legacy. But her fury didn't stop there. She turned it on David and me with a vengeance, as if we were the architects of her downfall, the ones who had dragged her secrets into the light. She began spreading lies, calling relatives and family friends with wild stories, claiming that I had manipulated David from the very start, that I had poisoned him against her, that I had planted doubts in his sister's mind to fracture the family out of jealousy. She even went so far as to post online, dragging our names through the mud, hinting at affairs that never happened, financial improprieties that didn't exist, anything she could reach for disdain us. What began as a mother-in-law's disdain had become a full-blown vendetta, and all because the truth she had buried for years finally surfaced in a way she couldn't control. Karen didn't just lose her grip, she tore the whole house down with her bare hands and somehow, even in the ashes, still blamed everyone else for the fire. 3 months after the scandal exploded and the dust had barely begun to settle, David's father quietly filed for divorce, a move that surprised no one but still carried the weight of finality. After decades of silence, of standing in the shadow of a woman who had rewritten their family's history to suit her own comfort, he was done. And though it was heartbreaking in its own way, it also felt like a necessary ending, like something long overdue was finally being laid to rest. David didn't waver. He stayed with us, fully, completely, with a sense of presence I hadn't known I needed so badly. Every night, without fail, he takes a shift with our son, sometimes humming lullabies in a soft, tired voice or pacing the hallway with bleary eyes but steady arms. He makes sure I eat, even when I say I'm not hungry, checks on me during night feeds, and kisses my forehead like it's the one thing he can offer when words fail. He's not perfect, but he's here and he's trying, and that means more to me than he'll ever fully understand. Despite how exhausted I am, how the nights still feel endless and my body is still aching and my heart still stings from everything we've been through, I am sure of one thing. We did the right thing. We protected our family. We shielded our son from a kind of legacy that corrodes love from the inside out. We stood our ground against a woman who wrapped her bitterness in tradition, who dressed her cruelty in the language of loyalty. And for the first time in years, the air around us feels clear. The silence isn't heavy with unsaid truths. The house isn't haunted by fear of who might show up at the door. We are tired, bruised, and healing, but we are whole and free.